weekend, I met another chess player who, when he learned my name, mentioned to me that he had done some puzzles on the Lichess server that actually had my name attached to them that were from my own games. And I was surprised. I had no idea that Lichess was harvesting my games for puzzles. But after I thought about it, it made sense because I've done the daily puzzle on there many times, and I know that they are harvested from actual players' games on there. There's actually a little link where it shows the players' names. You can click and see the game that the puzzle came from. So it makes sense if they're harvesting other players' games that they were harvesting mine too. I just didn't even know it. But once this player told me, it got me to investigate and find out that Lichess has a cool feature that if you go to the puzzles menu and then select puzzle dashboard, you can then see there's a feature that says from my games, and it will show you all of the puzzles that it has auto-generated from your games. So what this means is generally some, 1, 2, 3, maybe up to 4 move combination where there's a bunch of forced moves in a row. There's only one move that is correct in each of those positions in order to carry out the position to a victory for the side that you're trying to solve the puzzle for. And the puzzles that come about from your games happen because it's picked up a bunch of situations where it might be that you actually correctly executed that combination, or it might be that it was a missed opportunity that you could have executed that combination to lead to a win for you. And the same for your opponents. Many of the puzzles are ones where your opponent had either a missed opportunity or a forcing sequence that they played to get to the win. So I looked at a bunch of these puzzles, and one thing I quickly found is I think it's actually a really great learning tool. And in particular, the puzzles that often were the best learning tools for me, I think, were puzzles that I had a missed opportunity, where I could have played the winning combination but did not. Because that really tells me where there are some holes in my game, some things that I need to recognize better in order to take advantage of them. And I will say that there were different categories of these. Some of these might be because I just wasn't a good enough player, didn't know what I needed to do, or know how to find it in that position. But there certainly were some that fit into the category of ones that I think I would have found, but I didn't take the time. I do tend to play a lot of very fast speed games on the chess servers, and there are many times where I would have seen the winning combination if I took more time to look for it, but I rushed it. And I feel even in those cases where I know I could have found something in a slower time, it is still the case that there is value in learning from those kinds of mistakes and those kind of puzzles. Because a lot of what it's telling you is these are the places where I need to improve my intuition or pattern recognition, or I need to spot that there is a tactical possibility here and slow down and think about it more clearly. And I think that finding those kind of gaps in your game can help you improve yourself to the point where you build better recognition of those situations and you know what to do so that in future games you will be less likely to make those errors and find the right thing to do even at rapid time controls. So I'm going to go through 3 puzzles that came from my actual games, and in this first one I was playing the black pieces, and we are seeing this from black's point of view. He is going up the board, so his pawn is just 2 squares away from queening, and white's pawn has a lot further to go. However, it is the case here that if you look at this evaluation bar, this is all the way toward the black side. Black should be winning this game, and that is, of course, because his pawn is closer to queening, but I will tell you that it requires some delicacy to actually win this position accurately. And I failed to do so. I failed to convert on this opportunity. And I'll show you at first how that happened. I simply took the direct approach of launching my pawn up to g2, where it is 1 square away from queening. And you see that evaluation bar suddenly drop back. It is now actually a drawn endgame because white can sacrifice his rook for the pawn, and after the king takes, start running his pawn. And it's not just that black's king is too far away. It's that as white starts advancing his pawn and king, what we're going to see here is that black's rook is in a very bad position in front of that pawn. Where the king attacks it, it loses time and moves, and then the king and pawn come forward, and black has no choice but to sacrifice the rook for the pawn, and we get down to bare kings, which is how this game ended. However, if I go back to the original position And we now go over how black can actually win this position. This really is a great example of the old maxim, rooks belong behind passed pawns. In a rook versus pawn endgame, which is what we're going to get here because white is going to have to sacrifice his rook first, the best place for the rook to be is where it can get behind the pawn. And the way black can actually best execute that in this situation, his only winning move here, is to play rook g7, temporarily putting it behind his own pawn. But that's not really the whole point, just to put it behind his own pawn. It's that after white starts launching his pawn, g2, rook takes g2, black can now take with the rook. And this has two advantages. One is that black's king is not pulled as far away, but the other is that the rook is now in good position to get to the ideal defensive spot behind the pawn. So let's say white continues his natural way of just advancing that pawn to c5. We are now actually at another interesting point where black does have only one single winning move here. And I'll give you a moment to think about what that is. All right, well, I've already talked about how the rook belongs behind the passed pawn. So you might think the most direct and obvious thing to do is to move that rook over to c2 to stop the pawn from advancing immediately. But as you can see from the evaluation bar, this is not correct here, and in fact only leads to a draw. And the reason for this is because black's rook is actually going to have to at some point check white's king in order to make room for his own king to get closer. So in a way, this is actually just a loss of a tempo. Since the rook is moving, you're going to have to move back off the c file again. And we'll see what happens after white plays king d5, king f4, pawn c6, king f5, king d6, king f6, pawn c7. Now black could try checking white's king, but it just tops over to c6. And the problem is white is threatening to queen right away, so black has no time to get his king any closer. He could drop it to e7, of course, and after white queens, check him and trade off the queen for a rook. But again, that is only going to be a draw here. So black is just too far away. But going back, we might say, okay, so right after white played c5, we know that rook c2 wasn't the right move. What was the best way forward? Well, I've mentioned this thing about checking a king to push it out of the way. So you might be tempted to think rook d2 check is the right move here. But as you can see from the evaluation bar, it is not. And the reason is, white's move to ensure a draw here is to play king up to e5. This is very crucial. White's king actually moves away from his pawn, but toward black's king in order to cut black off from getting his king any closer. And white is in ideal position here because his king is still close enough to his pawn that if the rook attacks it, he can move back toward the pawn. But black's king can't make any progress in getting any closer here. So this will also only result in a draw. But going back, we've learned that both the rook c2 and rook d2 check moves are not correct. What remains, what black really should be doing here, is getting his king closer first with king f4. And we're going to show you that this is a really crucial part here. The kings are in what we call opposition, a sideways opposition here, where there's just one square between them and they are straight on the same rank here. And that's actually a key, because when black checks white's king, which he's going to want to do after white plays c6 and plays rook d2 check, the trick is that white cannot move his king forward and toward black's king. That's when you want to check the king. So it has to give ground and move away, letting black's king further in. So white is forced in this particular situation to move his king over to the c file, the same as his pawn. And there's actually a couple different ways to go with it. I'll show you one little nuance here to watch out for is white could try to be tricky and play king c3, attacking the rook, on the basis that it's stopping black's rook from dropping behind the pawn. But in this case, it actually just allows black to win the pawn right away by attacking it with rook d6. And now the pawn cannot be defended by the king, and if c7, just rook c6 check, black's going to win the pawn, and that is it. So going back, what we see is that after rook d2 check, king back didn't work. Let's try the more natural move of king c5, bringing the king up to help escort that pawn. But now that we've checked the king out of the way, black's king comes in, again with this sideways opposition to white's king. And after c7, black can check the king again and is again forced to give way to b6. But now black's king steps to d6, and we see that black is going to win because his rook is controlling the queening square, and his king and rook together attack white's pawn, which cannot be defended enough. So no matter what white does, black's just going to take that pawn on the next move. And that's how you win the game. So I found this to be a great practical example that's going to make me more aware of these kind of nuances in these endgames in the future and less likely to make the same kind of mistake. Looking at the next puzzle, actually a much shorter one. This is a puzzle that starts out with an equal position, maybe not quite an endgame yet, queen, rooks, and knights, but white has just offered a queen trade down to the endgame here. And a lot of it is pretty level in terms of material and everything else, except that white has one big problem in this position, which is his rook at a2. It's sitting there having no moves because black's queen is taking away all of those squares. And that means that black's first move is kind of obvious here, to take advantage of that stranded rook. It's to play his knight into b4, which is indeed the move that I played in this position. But after white plays queen takes c3, black now has a choice of which way to go in terms of recapturing that queen. Again, I'll give you a moment to think about it. So the move that I actually played in this position is the wrong one. I played rook takes c3. Recapturing the queen, seemingly charging down the c file, and now the rook and knight are both attacking the c2 pawn at once, while black's rook is still in danger. However, or white's rook is still in danger, but the big problem here is that white responds with rook b2, attacking black's knight. And now black has a problem. He cannot bring his rook down to c2 to capture the pawn because he'd lose his knight. If he defends his knight with a pawn at a5, then he's leaving his own d-pawn undefended, and white can actually just take that and save himself, because not only does he want a pawn, now he's protecting his pawn at c2. So neither of these worked out, but after rook b2, what black can do, and in fact I did in the game, is play knight takes c2, capturing white's pawn at the same time as defending the pawn at d4. But the problem at the end of this combination is that white gets his rook down to b7, getting a pawn of his own. And now white's rook is very active, and in fact, black has no more than a draw here. He can capture the d3 pawn, for instance, but white will get the a7 pawn, and both sides will have a passed pawn. The rook can get behind it, and they'll probably get traded off eventually, and it's really just a level endgame. But turns out, going back to the queen trade, I did have a better move, and obviously it's not hard to figure out now by process of elimination. It is to play d takes c3. Because after this move, black's knight is still attacking white's rook, but white's rook no longer has that b2 square. That pawn is guarding it. And what that means is the rook is forced to abandon the pawn, but not go to a more active place, but stay on the a file. So after rook a1, knight takes c2, the rook has moved somewhere else, like say c1. Black can drop his knight to b4 now, attacking the pawn at d3. So white might try, for instance, knight e1 to defend that pawn and try to keep black's pawn in check here. But now black can just solidify his knight with a5, and black has a completely winning endgame. He has an extra passed pawn at c3. He has all the time in the world to march his king to the center of the board and start advancing his kingside pawns. And very importantly here, not only are white's pieces passively placed trying to keep that c3 pawn in check, white's king can't get anywhere close to the pawn. Black is controlling and containing the squares, so white's king is condemned to be watching it from afar, and that pawn will never be in danger. And therefore, this actually is a pretty easy win for black here. So that's clear enough, but I looked back at this puzzle and I said, why did I get this wrong? And I definitely feel like it's one that the time control was a factor. It was a fast game. But I also think that a particular factor here is that this is a situation where white has a backward pawn on the open c file. And very often in middle games, you get this kind of situation where there is a backward pawn and a piece gets traded on the blockade square right in front of it. And often in middle games, it is more natural to take with a piece to maintain the blockade, to maintain the hole in front of the pawn, rather than a pawn where you're no longer putting pressure on the pawn. You can think of, for instance, Sveshnikov's Sicilians with the hole at d5. Usually white does not want to make a pawn capture, rather make a piece capture on d5 here. But while that is a general concern that is true in middle games in the long term, what's really more essential in this situation are some of the short-term tactics. And it also is a case that there's another interfering principle here, along with the backward pawn on the open file, of the importance of active rooks in the endgame. And one way to say it is that rook takes c3 is not so good because it allows white to activate his rook and get it into the game. But I think that all of these principles, whether we're talking about backward pawns on open files or active rooks, don't really tell the whole story. The key thing is that they can be general guidelines, but you really need to look at the specific tactics of the position. And it really only takes calculating a couple more moves from here to recognize that one of these moves, rook takes c3, just leads to a trade of pawns, the c pawn for black's b pawn, but the correct move, d takes c3, leads to an entire win of a pawn where white does not get to get any pawns back. So I hope this is a good lesson in terms of the importance of not thinking stereotypically just in terms of pawn structures, but thinking about the specific tactics in that position. And I hope that in the future, I will not make those mistakes because I will learn that I can't just think stereotypically. I have to take my time. But the next game is actually a much more complicated puzzle than the other two. And this one is interesting. I was actually also playing the black pieces, but I am showing it to you from the white point of view. And that is because this tactic was something that my opponent could have played, but there's a very interesting and funny story behind this, which I found by digging through the game. It was the case that I really had a better position for a long time with the black pieces. You can see I'm completely winning here. I had been winning since about move 16. It was move 24 now. And my opponent had played a very aggressive opening where he marched all his kingside pawns forward and tried to attack me, but it backfired and he eventually lost all those pawns. And looking at this position, white is now 4 pawns down, just hopelessly down, has no pawn cover for his king, should be completely busted. And it's actually worse than that for white because at this particular moment, he was down to 2 seconds on his clock and I had 1:23 left. So he's about to run out of time. And even though I had the greater amount of time here, I actually only took 3 seconds before I made my move in this position, which was my developing move, bishop g4. But you look, suddenly the bar has completely reversed itself. And we go from a position where black was totally winning to where now white should be totally winning. So bishop g4 was as big a blunder as they get. But the really funny story here is I told you my opponent was down to 2 seconds. There actually were no more moves in this game. What happened is white lost on time in this very position. So I had no idea this game was actually played a couple years ago. I had no idea at the time that I had made a horrendous blunder that should have given white a winning combination. And I only learned that yesterday when I discovered this puzzle. And I'm showing it to you because I think it's a good lesson in never giving up. Even when things are hopeless and you've been losing for a long time, there are good chances to come back. You got to watch out for that diamond in the rough combination. And even when you're winning, you shouldn't be too cocky and ignore the tactical possibilities for your opponent. And it shows you what rushing a move can do. If my opponent had more than those 2 seconds, maybe he would have found this combination. But more than that, I'm also showing it to you because it's just a very pretty combination that's actually very intricate and requires several moves in a row of white playing an exact only move in order to make it work. So the starting move for white here is the sudden rook sacrifice. Rook takes h7. He's charging down there with the rook, giving it up, and immediately threatening queen f7 mate on black's king. Now, of course, the natural first question you'd ask, well, what happens if black takes the rook? And the answer is, of course, that white charges in with queen f7 check. And you may have seen this kind of pattern before. After a sacrifice is made, the queen is checked down there. The king is now forced to stay up against the h-file, and no matter what, a rook is coming to the h-file, and it's going to be very bad for black here. So if king h6, for instance, rook h1 check, you notice the king has nowhere to run to, but he does have a defense at the moment. The bishop can come to h5 to block that check. But now white crashes through with rook takes h5 check. And this works very nicely because black's queen, if it takes, is going to be lost, and then he will be mated anyway without his queen to protect him. But if black instead plays the more natural g takes h5, the problem with this is that it has opened the diagonal for white's bishop, and now white's queen can sneak into h7 protected by that bishop and make a nice little checkmate on black's king with his queen blocking the escape square here. So that's the immediate obvious line, what happens if black takes the rook. But black actually has many other defenses besides taking the rook that need to be analyzed. So after rook takes h7, another move that black could have played here, a very natural move, is rook f8 to counterattack white's queen at the same time as he's defending the f7 square. But now we see an extension of the same tactic as on the previous move. White already sacrifices rook on the h-file once to try to draw him away so his queen can come in. And the right follow-up is for white to do it again with rook h8 check. Now the rook absolutely must be taken. If the king gives up to g7, queen takes f8 would be mate. But after king takes rook, queen takes f8 check, king h7, rook h1 check. Very similar to before, black's king is trapped up against the edge of the board and his only defense is to block with the bishop. But white crashes through in the same way. Rook takes h5 check. And this is a slight difference because black's king's on h7 instead of h6, meaning that the pawn is pinned and cannot recapture. So black has no choice but to lose his queen here to queen takes, allowing knight takes queen. But actually it's even funnier than that because in this position, white's obviously got a huge material superiority, but if we look carefully, black's king has no moves, is still completely trapped, and his pawn at g6 can't move either because of that pin, which means that all he can do is move one of his pieces on the left side of the board, but no matter which move he makes, white's going to follow up with queen g7 mate on the very next move. So this is in fact mate in one more move. So that disposes with the rook f8 defense, but black has actually a pretty similar defense of playing his rook up to e7 to guard that f7 square defended by his queen here. And it turns out that even though black's rook is not prone on f8 in this variation, it's actually the same tactic that wins for white here. He again plays rook h8 check, forcing black's king to the h-file. Now if king comes to g7, queen f8 is still mate. It's not capturing a rook this time, but even without a capture, it's still a checkmate. So black must take, and white plays queen f8 check. Now you may notice we have the same position as before with black having an extra rook at e7, but the fact is it doesn't actually make a difference that there's a rook at e7 here. After king h7, rook h1 check is still going to win after bishop h5 and rook takes h5 check. The only little nuance being that after queen takes rook, white doesn't even need to take the queen right away. Now that he's distracted the queen from the rook, white can grab the rook with check and then take black's queen on the next move and has a huge material superiority and will mate very soon. So now we've gotten rid of both black defenses with the rook, in addition to capturing the rook that white just sacrificed. But there are still other defenses here. And a very clever one that you need to be on the lookout for is black's counterattack with queen d2 check. This will still win for white, but he has to be careful which way he steps. If he goes the wrong way and allows black to continue checks, this can go wrong very easily. In fact, the move king g1, white is no longer winning. This is actually going to be a draw with best play. And the reason for that is that black gets the extra check at e3. And now, again, white has multiple ways to move with the king. But if he's not careful, not only has he lost the win, he can actually lose the game now if he goes the wrong way. And that could happen if white played king g2, because black has a nice little combination here. Keep in mind that black's been working with check while white's rook at h7 is undefended this whole time. So the very nice move for black here is to say, I'm going to force white's queen off the board and do it entirely with check so that I can grab that rook at the end. And the way to do that is the move queen f3 check. Sacrificing material temporarily, white has to trade queens. If he doesn't, black's going to take white's queen with check anyway. And after queen takes queen, bishop takes queen is check, meaning white has to take the time to recapture the bishop, and then black will take the rook at the end of it all, and black will have a material superiority and a winning position. So this is sort of a worst case scenario for white that could have gone wrong after king g1, queen e3 check. White doesn't have to lose this game, but if in this position he plays the more accurate move of king h2, black still has a really nice drawing resource here, and it is rook e7. Again, defending that f7 square with the queen able to drop back and defend it. But the main nuance that's different from before here is that white no longer has this rook h8 check and queen f8 resource because his king is now on the h-file, blocking his other rook from coming across with check. And that gives black the extra tempo he needs to save himself, and white actually has no way to win here. So, going back, we had to be a little more careful after black's queen d2 check. And the only winning move for white in this position actually was to retreat the king to h1, where there is no check at e3. Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, Dave. Okay, you avoided that check, but white's king is still on the h-file, stopping the rook from getting there. Yes, that is true. But the difference here is now if black takes the rook, his queen is in a worse position on d2, where it is no longer defending the g6 pawn, And after queen f7 check, white actually hits not just the king, but the weak points at g6 and e8 that are both undefended. And of course, if the king comes up to h6, queen g6 is going to be mate. But if the king comes back to h8, it takes a few more moves. But white still mates with queen takes rook. And after the king comes up, queen g6 check. Now black can't go back to the corner because of queen h7. But after king f1, rook f1 check, it's going to be a very easy mate in the next few moves. And black can, of course, if he wants, throw his bishop away and his rook away, or his queen away on the f file to save himself for a couple moves, but that doesn't change anything. Eventually, black's going to play king e7, rook f7 check, and after the king goes to the back rank, the queen and rook will mate on the back two ranks there. So we've now disposed with the queen d2 check defense, but again, that is not the end of the story. Black actually has another defense to stopping white's queen from coming into f7, and that is to bring his bishop over to f5, blocking its way. I should mention, bishop dropping to e6 back to defend f7 is also possible, but in fact, white plays the exact same thing regardless of which of those two bishop moves that black has played to win the game here. And this is tricky. There's only one move to win. Again, I'll give you a minute to think about it. Okay, the winning move is getting the last piece into the attack, that b1 rook with rook b takes b7. Now white's got those couple of hogs, the two rooks on the 7th rank that are protecting each other and very dangerously placed around black's king, and it's going to lead to a very bad mating attack soon. And but one of the only things that black can try to do to defend himself is to play knight d7, hoping to interfere with the two rooks and trade off some of these attacking pieces. And you do have to be a little bit careful. White could still mess this up. For instance, if he were to chop the bishop on f5 with one of his pieces, black would have time to just play king takes h7, ignoring the recapture. So white has to do something about the fact that his rooks are disconnected, but in fact, the only winning move for white in this position is to play rook b takes d7, and it has to be the b rook, because we have a little nuance here that black's bishop at f5 can't actually recapture that rook, as it would allow the queen to come into f7. And that is why it had to be that rook, so that after bishop takes, there still was a rook covering f7 for the checkmate. And at this point, it looks like curtains. Black is a piece down. He's got the mating attack coming soon. But in fact, there is one more nuance that white needs to be a little careful about here. Let's say in this position, black played queen d2 check. It's still a winning position for white, but you have to be careful not to be sloppy. You could still throw this away by a quick move of king g1, which would allow rook e1 pinning the queen to the king. And at this point, white can't get the queen anymore. He's going to lose it. He actually has nothing better than checking black's king on the back rank over and over with the rooks. It's going to be just a draw. However, the reason white is still winning after queen d2 check is that black had to retreat his bishop, so it's no longer guarding the e2 square. So it's actually simple for white to stop the queen checks just by dropping one of his pieces to e2, bishop e2. Knight e2 would also do the job. And this is a completely winning position for white. So many nuances to that combination, but I thought it was fun and had a lot of instructional value, and really told me I got to be more careful and take things more seriously even when I have what should be an overwhelming position. I hope you enjoyed the puzzles. Have a great day.